another episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. So in this episode, we got a pretty good mesh, I'd say, of pretty much all the topics that we usually cover on this show. We got a little bit of cybersecurity, we got some programming, and we got some Homelab stuff as well, and some comparison between hardware. So this is, I think, going to be a pretty good episode here. But first, we got to talk about some of the derp moments I had this week in this section of what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week? So the first derp moment I had was, I mentioned a few weeks ago that I created a script that basically takes two Ansible playbooks and runs them and wraps them in a bash script so I can do some other stuff as well to basically automate my backup process from my TrueNAS server to my Xserve. So I was doing some traveling this past weekend, and I figured, you know what? It would be a great opportunity to give this send it on its maiden voyage, or give it its first test run. And it was a great idea. Don't get me wrong, it was an excellent idea because, for one, I was going to be away from home, so I didn't have to hear my Xserve roaring away while it's going through this backup process. Now, in fairness, it would only be roaring away for about half-ish of the backup process, maybe even less than that, depending on how long it would take to archive everything on the NAS and transfer it, because how the script is set up is it's intentionally set up that the Xserve only gets kicked on once the archival process is complete, partly due to the fact that it's loud, so minimize the amount of time it's being loud, but also, limit the amount of power that's being consumed, because there's no point in having it turned on and, the first, say it takes, 5 hours, the first 3 hours of the process is archiving it, and then the last 2 hours is, transmitting it. There's no sense in having it on for 5 hours when it's only being in use for 2 hours, right? So, but it occurred to me that as I was on my trip, I realized that I did not plug the Xserve in. Now, don't get me wrong, lights out management on the Xserve is amazing. And the whole IPMI, lights out management, remote management from everywhere is fantastic. I did a whole episode on that. You can go check it out if you missed it. But it only goes so far. If your device isn't plugged in, you can't exactly use lights out management because there's no power. So, yeah, needless to say, I did not give that script its maiden voyage test run because I was not able to. So that was a big derp moment. But I did, while I was traveling, put that Wake on LAN feature that I added to my Server Connect program to the test, and that worked pretty darn well. So, obviously, since I have my Homelab accessible to me, I shut down one machine that I had its MAC address saved in my connections, and then from another machine in my Homelab, I ran the script, passed the WOL flag, and had a ping test running to keep sending a ping packet to the server that I had shut down. And then sure enough, within, maybe less than a minute or so, it started pinging again. And I was able to log back in, and it worked great. So that was pretty awesome to see. And can I just mention once again, I know I've probably, I'm basically just beating a dead horse here because how many times I've said it. But can I just say how awesome it is to have a Homelab with a VPN connection to it? So my Homelab literally goes with me anywhere I do, as long as I have internet, essentially. Technically, I don't even need my laptop for it. I mean, granted, it's a lot better with my laptop because trying to manage a Homelab with typing on a, touchscreen keyboard like my phone and having the small screen, while it's technically doable, it's not exactly the best experience. I mean, I've made do with it before in the past, but I definitely prefer having, that laptop, the slightly bigger screen, an actual keyboard and trackpad that I can more easily navigate things. But man, it is just so nice to be able to have, take the Homelab with me anywhere, so I can tinker on the go, as they say. Now, obviously, if I were to catastrophically break something, then I would not be able to tinker with it anymore until I was able to, get back home and fix it. Like, for example, if I was, playing around with stuff and I broke my VPN, or I bricked my router or something, or, something like that, then obviously I'd have to wait till I got back home to fix it. Or my VPN connection doesn't work because my router is currently not working because the Ethernet card overheated, which, by the way, it is still working fantastically. Although, I will say it's been a lot cooler recently, as we're starting to get into the late fall and winter months here. So heat isn't really an issue, I guess, at the moment. But regardless, I think that heatsink trick is working pretty darn well. Now on to the next derp moment. So I mentioned last week, I believe, when I updated my Server Connect program, that I did some restructuring and re-architecting of how the connections are saved to a file and the file name. Well, one thing I didn't do was update the script to uninstall my Server Connect program. Now, it still works. It still removes the program. But what it doesn't do is removes all the files. Because if you rename a file and you have your uninstall script looking for a specific file that is no longer the main file, it won't delete the new file. So, yeah, that was a big derp moment. Luckily, I caught it fairly quickly and was able to push a new update for that, so that's been fixed. And one thing I also realized, like after I pushed the update, since I mentioned in last week's episode how I kept, thinking that it was almost done and then I got an idea for a new update. Well, I eventually ended up pushing the changes for version 3.0. And then, of course, after that happened, I figured out some other ideas that'd be pretty cool to implement and would be really easy to implement. And this was a great excuse to do it because I already had to make changes to the uninstall script. So I figured, hey, might as well make some additional changes. And another thing that I also had to fix anyway was I was playing around with the script and I realized I thought I fixed everything with the SCP command to be able to copy stuff between your connections. But I realized in the process of thinking I fixed it, I also introduced a new bug. So, the whole 99 bugs in the code, 99 bugs, take one down, patch it around, 120 bugs in the code, that kind of a thing. That's kind of what happened. I patched some and then some others came up. But that's fixed, I think. I believe everything is good there. At least the testing I've done, everything seems to be working well. And the funny thing is, the initial solution that I made to do what I thought fixed the issue was actually way more complicated than it needed to be. Basically what I was doing was I was trying to find the instance of your connection by finding the colon, because when you do an SCP command, one thing you have to do is you put the username at, and then either the IP address or domain or however you're connecting, and then you do a colon, and then after the colon is what signifies the path to where you want to copy the file to, or where you're copying the file or files from. So basically what I was doing was searching for the colon and then everything before the colon, basically taking that as a substring, and then trying to find the last index of a space, and then from that, to get the connection. Because if you're at the last space, then obviously anything past that is just the connection name because we split it at the colon. And that introduced some problems, but the solution was so much easier because literally all I had to do was do the same thing of find the colon and split it there. And then all I had to do was split the string into an array and then so let me clarify this a little bit. Basically, I split the string on the spaces and then have that, and when you split a string in Python, which is what this program's written in, when you call the split function, it basically creates an array. So literally, because I'm splitting on the spaces, all I have to do is get the last index, and that's the connection name. So literally trying to, find the index of the last space and, all this shenanigans made my life way more harder than it had to be. So sometimes the simplest solution is the best solution. And since I switched to that, the new solution of just, splitting it and then getting the last index of the array, which is the connection, and then substituting that, things have been working good. I haven't found any new issues, so that's good. And then as far as the new things that I added, since as part of the dynamic pooling of the connection's MAC address, I added in a function to ping the hosts, and I figured I could just add ping as a new feature, because really all I had to do was just slightly modify that function to be able to take in an extra parameter for how many ping messages you want to send, and then have a check if you are sending more than one ping message to actually output whatever data you're getting from the ping to the terminal. Because if you're just sending like the default number of pings, then that's just the default ping to test if the connection is there, to get it in your ARP cache so you can pull the MAC address from it. So that worked. That was pretty easy to implement. And then the last thing I implemented was just an info flag, which was, really not much to it there. Just, prints out the version number, which I already had a flag to print out the version number, but then also printed out some copyright information as well, which there's not much really to that. It's just like, I don't even remember. I think it's like server connect, copyright, the year, and that's pretty much it. But, add a little more professionalism to it, I guess. So now that was some coding in there. So now one thing I wanted to talk about is some more cybersecurity related stuff. So now we're getting into the crux of the episode. This also kind of piggybacks off of stuff I was doing this week. But I don't remember. I guess it was about a year ago. I released a script that would allow you to have a command prompt on Windows if your command prompt was disabled. So in the school and work environments, it is not uncommon for the system administrators to disable users' access to the command prompt. So basically what will happen is if you click on the command prompt or you try to run cmd.exe in any capacity, you'll get a message that says the command prompt has been disabled by your administrator. So the reason I believe that they do this is essentially to prevent, it's basically a security measure to prevent, users from messing around and editing things and, basically messing up the system and doing stuff that they shouldn't be doing. But one thing that is rather interesting is every case that I've heard of where the command prompt is disabled, PowerShell is still enabled. Which, if you're familiar with PowerShell, you know that PowerShell is pretty powerful, as the name would imply. And from a cybersecurity perspective, that the PowerShell is pretty. I don't know if it's necessarily the go-to, but it's definitely one of the cyber attackers' like primary means to absolutely wreck your system if they get access to it. They just go for PowerShell because how much stuff you can do with PowerShell. Now, I will say one thing that PowerShell, but I guess to step back a little bit. One reason why some reasons why PowerShell isn't disabled. One of the bigger ones, which I actually didn't realize until doing some more research into the topic, because it kind of baffled me. Like, why is command prompt disabled but not PowerShell? That seems weird. So in researching this, I found out that apparently a lot of Windows installers nowadays are starting to incorporate PowerShell as part of the install process, which makes sense because there's a lot of stuff you can do with PowerShell to easily, change registries and incorporate DLLs and all kinds of, fancy stuff that you need when you're installing a program. And then some other things that you could use for it is like when you remote in to a Windows machine, like from a terminal, the default like shell, unless you do some extra configuration, is PowerShell. So it's kind of hard to disable it because you really can't, because how ingrained it is into Windows. Because if you just found a way to flat out disable it, you'd probably have issues installing programs, which would be an issue. And just with how ingrained it is into the Windows operating system itself, you really can't get rid of it. Now, another thing that I found very interesting is the Alphabet Boys, specifically the NSA and CISA, recommend not blocking PowerShell in favor of hardening it and monitoring and logging it. Which, honestly, who would have thought out of all of the Alphabet Boys, the NSA would be the one to recommend that you log and monitor everything your users do in PowerShell. Like the NSA, they would never do something so nefarious like that, spying on their own people and spying on their own users. Right? Like, absolutely flabbergasted me. Now, if that wasn't dripping enough in sarcasm, obviously I understand, where they're coming from, from the cybersecurity perspective of the idea of zero trust, and you don't want to trust any of your users. So you always want to, make sure they're not doing anything nefarious. But then that also goes back to the whole conversation of, do you value privacy or do you value security more? Because you can't really have both. Because if you want your users to have privacy, then you're not monitoring them and they could be doing nefarious things and potentially break your system. Or you could have the most security monitor everything they do to make sure they aren't doing anything nefarious, but they essentially have no privacy at that point. So you pretty much have to kind of, weigh the pros and cons of that. And that's a whole big debate. Now, one thing to PowerShell's credit, though, is it does give you the ability to set execution policies for users. And you can also configure it to only allow for signed scripts to be run. So basically what the latter means is basically the only kinds of PowerShell scripts that can be run are those that are created by the IT department and theoretically anyway aren't malicious. But there's a problem because just because you can only run PowerShell scripts that are signed, that doesn't mean you couldn't easily get around that, because there's a couple different workarounds that you could do. The first one is you could just, if you had the PowerShell script which you're not able to run, you could just, copy the contents of it, paste it in the PowerShell prompt, and bada bing, bada boom. Or if you're even lazier, what you can do is you can have all the commands in like a text document, literally a .txt file, and then you can pipe those into PowerShell with the basically pipe it through PowerShell, and it'll run them. And the way you do that is you type out type space name of the file pipe, or basically if you do shift and then backslash, it's that vertical thing, space PowerShell space -c space dash. You type that command, and whatever contents is in that file will be executed through PowerShell. So you don't need to worry about signed scripts because, quite honestly, they don't really do anything. It's basically like you put a little lock on your fence, right? If someone wants to get in through your fence, they're going to get through your fence. It's basically just, the whole check just to like keeping people honest kind of a thing. That's basically all it is. Because if someone wants to run PowerShell code, they can easily bypass the whole script not being signed thing. Now, as I mentioned, PowerShell does have the ability to set execution policies for users. So theoretically, if the admins configured it properly, then if you try to enter certain commands, they would be blocked because you wouldn't have the permissions to do that because of the execution policy. Of course, that is in theory. So credit there. So, and as far as I know, I don't believe command prompt has the same like set execution policy. I know it has like, administrator versus regular user privileges. So if you're just a regular user, you're kind of handicapped on, some of the commands you can run. But I don't think it's like as extravagant as PowerShell is. Now, going back to the script, I mentioned that this script basically lets you have a command prompt even though command prompt is disabled. Now, how the heck does that work? So if you look online for solutions to how to enable the command prompt has been disabled by your administrator, pretty much every single one of them requires you to have admin privileges to re-enable it, which obviously, if you're trying to get the command prompt back in a setting like a work environment or a school environment, you don't have admin privileges. So like all of these like tutorials on how to re-enable the command prompt through like registry edits and, I forget what the other one is, but there was another one that you have to like go through the notorious like nested Windows page settings to actually find what you're looking for. And of course, and somewhere in that chain, you need admin access. It's one of those things. But regardless, you need admin access to re-enable it, which if you're trying to re-enable the command prompt, I would likely bet that you probably don't have admin privileges in the first place, because if you did, you probably wouldn't have disabled it. Just a general assumption. I mean, obviously, there would be some cases where if you're in like some kind of like Active Directory, domain situation where it's all managed, it might be just like a default setting that they have pre-configured for Windows that you would then have to go in as the admin to re-enable when you need to use it. But generally, if you're an admin, you're probably using PowerShell anyway, but it is what it is. Now there's some other solutions out there where basically what people will do is essentially my solution, except my solution I believe is better because obviously mine's better. But basically what their solution does is it prompts you for input, and then just inside of a batch file, which you can essentially think of a batch file as a list of command prompt commands to run. So they basically have an infinite loop in this batch file that only exits like when you type in exit or just hit the X icon. So basically what it does is it'll prompt you to enter, a command or text or whatever. And then you enter that, and then it just essentially uses that as the next line in the batch file and then loops back to the beginning. Now, this will get you, I'd say about like 75-ish% of the way there. Now, it definitely has some drawbacks. Number one is the prompt that they use is not the command prompt. So if you open up a command prompt in Windows, it'll basically give you what your current directory is. But this solution doesn't do that, and it can't do that. unless you do some other trickery. And the other thing that it can't do is it can't use environment variables. So in the command prompt, there are these things called environment variables. It's also, like Linux and Mac OS also have environment variables too. But in the Windows world, if you do like % user profile %, for example, and hit enter, it'll basically print out what your home directory is. So if you're on Windows, it's generally C:/users/ whatever your username is. So if you do CD %user profile % and hit enter, it'll take you to your home directory. And there's other ones too. There's like system drive, there's path, there's a whole bunch of them. Now, this solution that a lot of people write, which the batch file itself is really small. It's like, I think, no more than 10 lines. It's pretty darn short. And that'll get you most of the way there, but it does have some fairly decent limitations to it. The version that I created essentially fully emulates the command prompt entirely. It gives you the same, when you open the command prompt, it gives you the same, Windows version and then copyright of Microsoft. And then it has the accurate path. And even if you change directories, it'll keep the accurate path there as part of the prompt. The only thing that it is lacking is the ability to create new temporary environment variables. So one thing that you can also do on the command prompt is you can set temporary environment variables, which you basically call set whatever you want the variable name to be and then something. Now, my version does not do that, is unable to do that mainly because of how it's written. So in order to get access to environment variables, like system environment variables, you have to run it through the command prompt itself. You can't just have it as a line in the batch file. The problem is if you run command prompt by itself, you'll get the error the command prompt has been disabled by your administrator. So how do you get around this? You have to type the CMD and attach the /C flag, and that'll essentially tell command prompt to run this command and then exit. Now, I guess one thing I should also mention is how are you able to run batch files if the command prompt is disabled? So in the setting where you can disable the command prompt, there's also a setting to enable or disable batch files. Now, I would say 99.9% of the time, batch files are going to be enabled purely because of how much they're used for configuration processes by either system administrators or whatever. So because batch files are enabled, that's what allows us to create a batch file to essentially emulate and simulate the command prompt. So there are a couple flags you can pass for the command prompt, the cmd.exe. If you pass the /k flag, that just essentially opens up a new command prompt, and that'll give you the error of the command prompt has been disabled by your administrator. Or if you just pass in the dash, or if you don't pass any flags, then it'll try to open it up and it'll give you the same error. So that's why the -C flag comes into play, because that's what allows you to just essentially run this single command in the command prompt and then exit. And because you're doing this, like I mentioned, this allows you to use the environment variables. Some other ones are windir, program files, computer name. So, definitely an improvement. And I would say this version is about 95% of the way there. And I definitely could implement being able to set environment variables. The only thing is you'd have to do so much parsing in order to do that. And personally, I never use them. I never set local environment variables, so I didn't bother implementing them. But how it worked. But one thing that you might be thinking of is if you're using this one-time command prompt to function as the command prompt, then how do you change directories? So this is another kind of hack that I incorporated into the script. And basically what it does is every time you run a command, you also output whatever your current working directory is to a file. And then on the next loop, you read in that file and then you CD to that directory. So it's not exactly the cleanest solution, but it works. And I mean, every function that you'd want in the command prompt, aside from setting local environment variables that I've tested, has worked. I'm able to compile code. I'm able to launch a Python terminal environment thing. I'm able to navigate around the file system. I'm able to create files, delete files, everything that I'd want to do with the command prompt, I'm able to do with this batch file. So if you're interested, it's up on my GitHub. If you are in the crowd of people that does not have access to the command prompt and you want it back, you can feel free to download the batch file. Now, some reasons that I should mention of why you would actually want to do this. Obviously, if you don't need the command prompt, then you don't need the command prompt. But, some people, like software developers, for instance, kind of need it. Sometimes it's easier to compile and run code that way through like a command line interface, and some people like that. So having an actual command prompt that you can use is nice. I guess you could use PowerShell, but so yeah, that's the running a command prompt, even if it's disabled. So if you have had that problem and you wanted to find a workaround, there is indeed a workaround. So if you go over to my GitHub, Dark Assassin 23 on GitHub, you can find a repository over there called Disabled Command Prompt Bypass, and you can go ahead and download that batch file. Now getting over to the Homelab side of things. So I mentioned it was either last episode or a couple episodes ago, part of I guess it was last episode, talking about me wanting to potentially build a Kubernetes cluster, but, Raspberry Pis are insanely expensive. I did not purchase any hardware, which may or may not surprise some of you, but I did potentially find a replacement for the Raspberry Pi. So this comes in the form of the Dell Wyse 5070. And the reason why this is a pretty attractive option is because you can buy these on eBay for ballpark $50. And if you find like a lot of them, like someone trying to sell like 5 or 6 of them, you can find them for even cheaper than $50. Obviously, it's going to be more than $50, but on like a per device basis, it'll be less. And these configurations that I found for around the $50 range come with 4 gigs of RAM and about 16 gigs of storage, and a Celeron J4 4105 processor, whatever that is, and a comparable Raspberry Pi with the Raspberry Pi 4 with the 4 gig is currently going for about $120 on eBay. And I say specifically eBay because that's really the only place you can buy one. And also keep in mind that the MSRP for the 4 gig model is about $55, but that's also just for the board and the power supply, so you'd have to bring your own storage. I think in most cases you'd have to, whether that's like an SD card or a SSD or hard drive with a USB adapter, and that comes with a Broadcom BCM 2711. So mumbo-jumbo tech jargon, gibberish-laden tech specs aside, practically what this means is both of these devices have 4 cores and 4 threads, as well as 4 gigs of RAM. One area that the Raspberry Pi lacks is it doesn't come with storage by default. Now, obviously, you can purchase a Raspberry Pi with storage, but that generally costs extra. The Wyse machine does have built-in storage, and it also has an internal M.2 slot, so you can add even more storage if you wanted to, and pretty darn fast storage at that. And similarly, the RAM in the Wyse is upgradable, whereas the Raspberry Pi's is soldered on. So if you ever wanted to upgrade the RAM on a Raspberry Pi, your option is to buy a new one, or maybe, I guess, if you're good with the soldering iron, you might be able to solder a larger RAM chip on there. Your mileage may vary. I'm not necessarily recommending that, but hey, if you want to really tinker around, by all means, go ahead. Now, one area that the Raspberry Pi does, kind of pull out ahead here a little bit is it takes up less space, obviously, because it's super tiny. I mean, granted, these Wise computers are really small because they're essentially thin clients, and basically what that means is they're meant to essentially act as a terminal for you. So basically, you log into this machine, and then through either a web browser or a command line or some other interface, you essentially log into a virtual machine, off in a data center somewhere, and do your work there, not actually on the local machine, which is why they have so little RAM and so little storage, because all the work you're doing is on other people's computers, which, by the way, I saw this is completely off topic, but I saw a sticker a couple weeks ago. It was about there's no such thing as a cloud, it's just someone else's computer, which I thought was awesome. Because it's so true. So basically that's the point of these Wise thin clients, is to connect to someone else's computer. But at the end of the day, it's just a computer, so you can, throw whatever you want on it. Assuming the operating system or whatever you put on there doesn't take up too much storage, because you don't have much. But anyway, the Raspberry Pi does take up less storage. It uses less power, although it's not by that much, and under full load, I think that difference would grow a little bit, but I mean, still, I think these Wise computers, they draw I want to say 10 watts max, which I think a Raspberry Pi draws around 7 watts max, when it's, fully maxed out. So obviously, there is a little bit of a gap there, but I mean, we're talking barely any power. So they're both really low power. But the other benefit that the Raspberry Pi has going for it is that it can be powered by Ethernet through a PoE connection, assuming that you get the adapter hat for it. But this makes clustering them super simple, because you can essentially have there's a bunch of things that you can either 3D print or buy off of, Amazon or some other online marketplace, that you can basically join a bunch of Raspberry Pis together. There's even rack mount kits for Raspberry Pis, because of course there is. But essentially, because you can run them over Ethernet, you don't even need to worry about a power cable, which could be nice if, power outlets are a premium for you, so you don't have an entire power strip dedicated just for your cluster, which could be kind of annoying. Plus, in addition to that, if every Raspberry Pi has its own power connection, I mean, then you have 2 cables going to each Raspberry Pi rather than just a single cable. So it makes the clustering a lot easier and a lot nicer, and a lot cleaner than if you had to have a power cable and an Ethernet cable. But performance-wise, that's a little bit of a different question. So the BCM 2711 in the Raspberry Pi scores 834 according to CPUbenchmark.net in its multi-threaded performance, and single-threaded performance is 597. Now, for comparison, the Wise 5070 that we were talking about with that Celeron processor scores 2,892 and 1,090 respectively. So it basically blows the pants off the Raspberry Pi as far as performance goes. So honestly, looking through, the specs and kind of what you get for the price, honestly, I kind of got to say, if you're waiting for Raspberry Pi prices to fall, really, unless you actually need the GPIO pins that the Raspberry Pi offers, or you need an ARM architecture or some other niche use case that the Raspberry Pi can give you, other than just a cheap, low cost, low power tinkering machine that you can play around with your Homelab for clustering. Honestly, I gotta say, the Wise computer here, or other similar things like it, like other thin clients, is honestly a pretty compelling option, I gotta say. And honestly, since I mentioned, last episode kind of wanting to build a Kubernetes cluster, I obviously haven't pulled the trigger on anything, but I think these Wise machines might have leapfrogged to the top of my list as far as potential options for a potential cluster down the road. But we'll see. If I get around to ever making one, you definitely will hear about it. That is for sure. So we got a little bit of time left in this episode, and I wasn't thinking about talking about this, but I figured, what the heck, everyone's on the Twitter bandwagon, so why don't we talk about the absolute meme fest that is Twitter.com right now. So if you've been living under a rock for the past, week and a half or 2 weeks, Twitter has been going through some pretty big changes. Now, I obviously don't have a Twitter, and I don't plan on ever having a Twitter, and I quite honestly don't even care about Twitter. But recently, Elon Musk, the legend himself, bought Twitter and has been, I don't know the best way to put it. Let's just say he's been making a lot of changes. And people, of course, because it's Twitter, have a lot of opinions. Now, one of the most hilarious things that he did, in my opinion anyway, was when he bought Twitter and walked into Twitter HQ, he carried a sink into Twitter HQ. And you might be wondering, why did he bring a sink in? Because of the old meme of Elon just bought Twitter, let that sink in. So he was literally letting that sink in by carrying a sink into Twitter HQ, which absolutely incredible. What a legend. Now, he's also been doing a bunch of other things as far as how Twitter works and a bunch of stuff behind the scenes that all the Twitter fanboys and fangirls have been absolutely losing their minds over. Now, I haven't been keeping up all that closely with it because, like I said, I really don't care. But what I have seen is one thing that Elon implemented was there was this thing on Twitter that everyone craved, which was the blue check mark. And if you had the blue check mark, you were somebody. And if you didn't have the blue check mark, you were a nobody and nobody cared about you. At least that's how people wanted to make it sound. But what Elon did was he was like, if you pay me $8 a month, I'll give you the blue check mark. So what people were doing was people were paying, $8 a month for the memes and creating parody accounts to look like real accounts and just absolutely going to town. And obviously, since I'm not on Twitter, I don't see everything, but I've seen some phenomenal screenshots from some of these parody accounts that are pretty entertaining. One of the examples for these parody accounts was someone with the Twitter handle Lockheed Martini, not to be confused with Lockheed Martin. They had their name set as Lockheed Martin with a profile picture of Lockheed Martin, and they had the check mark. And they put out some tweet about not wanting to sell arms anymore until, I don't remember what the condition was. But after that tweet was posted, Lockheed Martin, their stock price tanked, which I thought was kind of funny to see because some meme account which obviously is parody because you see the Twitter handle Lockheed Martini, obviously not the real thing, posted a tweet and people mistook it for the real thing because they didn't bother to do any kind of investigative work, and which really wouldn't take any investigative work. It would just take looking at the tweet for more than 2 seconds, but I guess that's longer than the average attention span of a Twitter user. But yeah, the stock price tanked, which kind of funny. But there's a ton of other situations similar to that where people would take legit people's Twitter handles that they wanted to parody off of and then change I's to lowercase L's, or, zeros for O's, or, these kind of like minor things that you would do to try to impersonate someone. So at like a first glance, it looks legit. But then once you actually look into it, you realize clearly that it's fake and not real. But I guess, that check mark was throwing everyone off. So there was a lot of this going on, and a lot of it was definitely not appropriate for the family-friendly programming that we do here at the Dark Assassins podcast. But needless to say, I found these quote-unquote verified accounts that were really just parody accounts to be quite enjoyable and quite hilarious. So if you're interested, you can probably easily do with some quick internet searches, find some of these legendary memes that these parody accounts were posting. But yeah, it's interesting. Pretty much all of the accounts of what's been going on Twitter that I've heard is pretty much like, this could change and be outdated by the time this episode's over, or whatever. But obviously those are people that actually care about Twitter and are in on Twitter like all the time. Me, I'm just like an outsider that, sees these things like crop up just for fun, and I have zero stake in the matter and really don't care what happens. And I honestly, just from the outside perspective, like having no stake in Twitter and never using the platform and have no desire to use the platform, just kind of looking at it from afar is absolutely hilarious. Which I guess kind of, goes along with the theme of it being owned by Elon. Like it's an absolute meme and you have no idea what's coming next, and if you don't have any skin in the game, it is a fun ride to watch. That is for sure. And as far as fun rides, I hope you had a fun ride on this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. And if you enjoyed it, I'd ask that you leave a rating and review and subscribe to the Dark Assassins podcast if you haven't done so already. Also, be sure to share with a friend or family member who might be interested in any of the topics we covered. Whether it's potentially, maybe they're waiting on a Raspberry Pi and you can give them an alternative, or maybe they don't have a command prompt access and they want one at their work, school, or wherever, and you can now give them the hookup. And if you have any questions about this episode, or you have any topics that you want me to cover in a future episode, you can send me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. There is a link for that down in the show notes below. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bull nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.